Welcome back to another episode of the IFC's Individuation podcast. I'm Dr. Lahab Al-Samarrai. As with always, with me today are the Wrecking Crew. Dr. Eric Tomlinson is with us today. Dr. Lisa Hong is with us today. And as always, we will bring you live all the adventures of the three amigos. Okay, now let's get into the story. Do you
Where did
Dr.
we leave
Lisa?
off last week? Yeah, we are talking from chapter 5 of Murray Stein's Young's Map of the Soul.
Yeah.
And we would love for you to follow with us. And this chapter is titled The Revealed and the Concealed in Relations with Others, Persona and Shadow.
So today we're going to discuss another part of this idea of what Jung postulated about how the psyche is created and how the self, that the ego is a tiny projection of self, and that within self there are a variety of creation states. We move through different ways of relation in the world, and that it's varied, which means it's more expansive, which means the answer is not always right and left, right and wrong. This is where the evolution of the shadow and the persona occur. This is how the triangle is built, because the ego has to function on some aspects of right and wrong, left and right. What do you think, Dr. Eric?
Well, it makes me wonder. I don't mean to get too Jungian or even Freudian here.
We're definitely Jungian in here.
But regarding the ego movements, how much of that relates to the conscience, the superego? How much of that is moving or guiding or steering the ego toward a certain understanding of things? And that's what I'd like to ask to you, because you understand these processes a little better than I do. And I'd love to ask you that question.
Well, the topography of Freud's psyche would be that the ego sits on top of the iceberg that points outside the water. So the ego would be there, the id would be deep downside in the unconscious. So
what about the superego?
Well, that would be part of the ego function. So in Freud's theory is that the superego is an outgrowth of the ego. It's its own complex. Because we're going to confuse people because we're talking Jungian. But okay, let's talk some Freudian. So in Freudian terms, superego is its own complex. The ego is its own complex, and the id is its own complex. Ego is mediator between, the triangle goes, it's mediator between the superego and the id.
That's how I understand it.
Okay. In Jungian theory, the way they propose it is it's the ego, the shadow, or what we're calling the unknown other, and the persona. That's the triangle. So we could postulate that Freud would say that the persona exists within the superego, because that's your mask. The superego is rigid depending on what happened to you. So if they function normally, you should function normally. You with me? So if you haven't been traumatized,
that's the first time I've ever heard that said. And I really appreciate that. It's based on what has happened to you. That was brilliant. I really enjoyed that. Thank you for saying that.
so what we're talking about is the rise of the glitch, right? And we talk about the glitch in JAMP and the resolution of the glitch, but what we're talking about is the one.
Isn't there a book about that?
Yeah.
Yes, we wrote a book about that.
Okay.
It's this one, JAMP and the resolution of the glitch.
Mm.
Anyway, the
Thank you.
story is that when the glitch occurs, what happens is that a new triangle is formed. So let's say there was a triangle that was, when there's a glitch, when there's trauma, a new triangle is born because the complex has taken in the glitch. So it's going to contain more energy than the other parts of the psychological alignment, or what Jung talked about as orbits. The orbits change. Trauma changes the orbits of the complex. The complex becomes more active, and it surcharges its energy. It's like if somebody said mother, and I lost my mother at a really young age, and I was like in love with everything that she was, and I miss her dearly. And somebody says mother, that is activation for me. That is going to activate me. It supercharges me. My mother complex is like supercharged because the trauma was so big. So you're supercharged by it, and it takes over. It makes you feel like that child that just lost their mother. You start to become angry. You start to become defensive. You start to become argumentative. You start to feel those emotions of loss that you haven't felt since that day. You start feeling that heat rising in your chest. That's the trigger, and that's the complex. And that's why Jung talks about, or Stein talks also about, the nuclear core of the complex. It just starts as self-perpetuating energy. It starts drawing on itself. And the more energy it draws, the less the other complexes have. That means they can't act. They're frozen actors. So this complex acts it out. Now, okay, because we're talking about shadow development. What happens if that traumatic incident was at the hands of that child, and he hears the term mother, and that excites his need for rage, for aggression, for control, for reprisal? So then that child grows up with that man is dangerous.
I'd like to ask you a question, Dr. Lahab.
Yes.
In my, I don't know, 40 years of studying sociopaths, why is it that most sociopaths, especially extreme sociopaths, and even to the point, if you go all the way to the end of the spectrum and include psychopaths, why is it that the majority of them, and this isn't even close, always blame in their own psychology the mother and not the father?
Well, that's because the feeling of love and empathy that they experience firsthand is on the hands of the mother. The mother is the first face they see. She's the first body that warms that infant. It is the mother's extension of food. They are an extension of the mother. So if you have gestated a monster, it's because of the connection between you and that child. The child is what we create in the relationship. If the relationship works, the child is healthy, bound, loved, and loving and connected. If the relationship is dysfunctional, the child is dysfunctional. Good relationships, bad relationships can't keep their end of having a good relationship, not knowing how to create a good relationship, always ending up alone. Disorganized, disoriented. It depends on the style of the parents who are in that household. Strict, abusive, demeaning, sarcastic. That child will grow up with those feeling states and responding to those feeling states and thus echoing those feeling states. Because what the parents do is imprint on the child.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, Dr. Lahab, obviously when the mother is and we see this over and over again with sociopaths and psychopaths, that when the mother is one of the primary givers of abuse to this child, we see what happens. But also, if I'm not mistaken, also the mother can be a passive participant in this evolvement of the child, where the father does the majority of the abuse, but the mother is a passive individual that doesn't counteract that abuse. And so the automatic response to the child is to blame the mother for the lack of nurturing and the lack of protection.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because we're not blaming the mother for her connection to the child. What we're
Absolutely
saying,
not.
what we're saying, or
It's a distortion of the child.
We're magnifying the connection.
Yes.
And magnifying a pathological connection between the mother and the child. We're not talking about the normal magnified projection between the mother and the child. There are many things that could go wrong between the mother and child, and we don't have a sociopathic child.
Well said.
That's not how it works.
Right.
There are also other elements to this, right? There are elements that this is intergenerational. That mother, that grandmother, that great grandmother was abused. That the abuse that they suffered was sadistic.
Yes.
And it was passed down unconsciously or consciously to their siblings throughout the line. And somebody has to break the line, right?
Yes.
That's how intergenerational trauma stops. Somebody has to break the line and says, not me. I need to go to treatment. I need to work on myself. I need to get out of this feeling state that I'm always in. But unfortunately, when you've suffered that much abuse, it's not the blame of the mother, but it's not the blame of the child, but this is intergenerational trauma. So the trauma is much greater that is created by the mother towards the child. And it just takes a couple of generations before that goes bad. And then you have what becomes a really menace in a lot of ways to society. The kid at the University of Idaho who's studying criminology and killed 3 of his classmates. basically. If they weren't his classmates, they were his college mates. These killings were, so that sociopathy, apathy, if you will, that has to be traced, right? That has to be traced as to where it started, where it began, and there's something in its past. This didn't spring like a chicken, came out of nowhere.
That's right. It
This is
doesn't.
not somebody rolled an egg and the egg hatched and then we had a chickling out of nowhere. No. There is a origin. There is a story. There is an origin story to everything. Everything has a timeline, an emotional, a psychological, a physical, a geographic timeline that we all go through. What do you think, Dr. Lisa?
Talking about, when I try to identify why does the blame, the arrow get, finger get pointed to the mom a lot, but that is, like you said, that is the origin point of how we interact with the world. Yeah. And this is the origin of how it is we are vulnerable and we know we are vulnerable, and that feeling of safety and being provided for and being fed and sheltered when there is that is the most likely place for the first feeling of betrayal or abandonment, unreasonable punishment, that translation, the reason why it came down or whatever the mother's feelings are, that's her glitch carried on through generations. And so but how the infant child interacts with that is partially their glitch too, that they take on and change and hold as their own. And so it's easy to go to the mother first. The father is not as present in the rearing of a child for the first several months. Who has the teat? Who is the warmth heartbeat that is familiar, that they know from the womb? So I think,
it's the heartbeat, right?
Yeah.
It's the heartbeat that calms us. It's the heartbeat that gives us that sense of being in the world. And if that mother was traumatized by a sadistic family, or she found her way towards a sadistic relationship because of what she grew up with, because of what she knew, because of what she didn't knew, because she was abused, because for so many other reasons, right? Because she was a victim, because she got re-victimized, there's a lot of reasons why we end up in places we don't need to be. But the origin of pain and trauma doesn't go away. It is passed down. And if you don't have children, it's passed down to your stepchildren, or if you don't, they'll be passed down to your best friend's children that you see all the time. It'll be passed down because somewhere inside of you, there's something that is sending out a bad message.
Or a good message in defense. I mean, there are lots of things.
Tell us more.
When as someone, I don't have any kids, but I have lots of friends with kids, and you'll find yourself saying things and you're like, that's not for me. That's on me. That's my stuff. Why do I need to say that? And those are my fears. Those are my insecurities. And I'm trying to help them and defend them. But it's not necessarily needs to be shared or said, because it's not anything that has to do with what they're dealing with. so it comes out.
Well, I'm glad. I'm glad I asked you the question, Dr. Lahab, because I knew that you would explain it in a way that encapsulates a broader perspective than what I was aiming toward. On the other hand, this idea is worldwide. And why does the United States of America why do we have a monopoly on serial killers? They exist everywhere in the world, but we have a monopoly on them. Why is that? Because we are
culture breed more.
We are an individualistic nation. And you see so far fewer serial killers in the Asian countries. And even when I'm older than most people, so I remember growing up in the 60s and late 50s, and there just wasn't a lot of this going on. But individualism, an individualistic culture, spawns this in a way that communal cultures don't. When I was a kid, people who had the attributes toward these kinds of things, they didn't have an access to the community and to the world at large the way that they do now. They were kept at home. I mean, they were the weird kid that was kept at home that everybody in the community knew about, but nobody talked about. And now we live in a society where everyone is free, quote unquote, and has access to huge amounts of people. And it's just amazing to me that this kind of thing is rampant in our modern day society in the United States. And it has been for the last 30, 40 years. And what we've been talking about is what happens all over the world, because about 25 to 30% of children all over the world are abused.
So Dr. Eric, let me kind of try to
interject,
bring us back to what we're trying to kind of create the image or the story of. Thank you for talking about how we have an inordinate amount of sociopaths, and
no problem.
We do have different theories about why we have so many sociopaths, and one of them is because we are, well, you know, there are several different things. One is geography. Your ability to hide your sociopathy is magnified, is quadrupled, because we have such great geography that people can hide in different places. Which would, you know, we're individualistic culture that also breeds a way of people not asking about why people are behaving in certain ways or doing certain things. I think we're becoming more conscious of these aspects of our culture. Let's get back to our original.
My apologies for going off on a tangent.
Unnecessary. We're going to go back to our, like we started, because I think I took us off track. So let's go back to the development process. So what we're talking about is development. We're talking about how the psyche is affected in development, how the ego is affected, how the shadow and the persona are affected, how do these psychological complexes, according to Jung, how does the triangle move? How does it spin? Is it connected? Is it disconnected? So the more we suffer trauma, the more this triangle is disconnected. What that means is that the aspects of it are disassociated. So if there's something I don't like, I don't think about, because it goes into another complex. And this becomes dangerous, because what is going on is a development of disassociation, and the way I move in the world is of disassociation. Now,
Dr. Lahab, may I give a biological perspective to sociopathy?
well, hold on to
Okay,
that thought. Let's do that. Let's do that next week. I
no
would like
problem.
to, because we're expanding on the idea.
I'll put it on hold, sir. Thank you.
Today we're talking more about development. So I
Okay.
think we should stick around that idea of what is development, how does it work, how does the ego develop? The ego needs stability. It needs stability at home. The household needs to be stable. It needs some rules and regulations of how to function, when to go to bed, when to wake up, when the ego needs structure. The ego needs to fed as a diet of positive reinforcement and structure. The ego needs places where it can expand its thinking about the world. So it's also reading or thinking or seeing perspectives from other people's perspective, and that helps expands its consciousness. It also helps stabilize the ego, that it doesn't have a jagged view of the world, or a very jagged edge view of the world, where it only sees a sliver. It does not see the way the world is built.
Dr. Lahab.
Yes, sir.
May I give a biological perspective to support what you just said?
Sure, go for it.
Most studies in neuropsychology show that from about the age of 6 to about the age of 14, as you expose your children to multiple dimensions of thought, of reasoning, of understanding, that those individuals become a multi-dimensional person as they grow into an adult. So anyone who's a parent should understand that from especially about the age of 6, and that's the reason for that is because that's when the human brain starts developing abstract thinking, all the way to about the age of 16. Those are the primary years of neuronal development, depending on the learning that that individual is taking in. So the more they're exposed to broad spread learning, as opposed to just staying stuck in a house and not exposed to anything, it can create a dramatic increase in brain mass growth up to 20%. So this is why it's so important to educate children from the age of 16 to about 6 to about 16 on a variety of concepts and a variety of information. And as you do that, it expands the brain and the ability to think of the children that have been exposed to that. This has been verified through numerous studies.
So thank you for that. There's a recent release data based on a study that's been going on, a longitudinal study that's been going on for over 60 years in Britain during the war, they started tracking children that they had rehoused with different families. They started tracking those families and those children from the day they were rehoused to the day they were reunified after the war, and over the generations and what happened to them. And what is a clear stat, and this is an amazing study because the amount of data that they gathered over years, and it's a huge population of children that we're talking about. So the data shows one consistent theme. Can you guess what it is? What is the number one thing that is detrimental and that you can't catch up in any way to the rest of society? And that thing is poverty. Any kid who's born into poverty ends up achieving, learning, participating, economically devastated more in the society than any other child. They are behind in school by first grade. And this means that between kindergarten and first grade, they are behind by 2 years.
Yeah.
And that is with their parents reading to them, with their parents tucking them in at night, with their parents providing them food and shelter. With that, they are still behind.
I'm surprised. So I was wondering about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The requirement of food and shelter. That was my first guess of.
Yeah.
So even given that consistent provision, it's actually the quality of the food and shelter that
quality of food and shelter, and quality of what Dr. Eric was talking about, which is this ability to connect to a wider environment that expands the way we see the world and how we see ourselves in the world.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well said.
Having an enriched and diverse exposure of structures and reward systems, maybe even to
different ways of being, Dr. Lisa. I think is what your experience of a different culture gives you insight that's beyond the culture that you're in. It's almost like it's expanding the wave of consciousness in front of you. It's like, wow, there's these things that you could do. Wow, there are these things that you could taste. Wow, there are these dances you could, so there are these words that you could use that we don't have these words. So it enriches the connections in the brain. Because this reinforces the ideas that we are not alone, right? Because this is the idea that holds us back. This is fear, right? There's underlying fear that, am I going to be okay? Is mom going to be okay? Is dad going to be okay? Do we have enough? Because poor families talk about not having enough. I mean, this is a huge issue, right? You're always lacking. You're always needing. This is imprinted on you. These are your gods. These are your creators. And that was one of the things that we started with, right?
Interestingly enough, Dr. Lahab and Dr. Lisa, if you look at the developmental brain mass of children over a 10-year period in Yugoslavia, when it broke up and turned into 4 different nations, over those 10 years, if you take the tens of thousands of children that were literally put into places where they would only have one couple that took care of 100 different kids that were abandoned or orphaned, and you compare their brain mass with those of Dr. Lahab, you and I know this, since we lived in Chicago for 20 years. If you go to the upper suburbs of Chicago, which are the richest at that point in time, were the richest in the country, and you compared the brain mass between those kids in Yugoslavia and those kids in North Chicago suburbs, there was actually a 20% difference in brain mass.
Yeah, it's substantial because of the deprivation, right? Because the emotional,
Yes,
psychological deprivation.
because of
You're
the
also talking about you're also talking about educational systems. You're talking about food. You're talking about water.
everything.
You're talking about physical and mental health.
Yes,
You're talking about the
and brain
ability
stimulation.
the ability to play, the ability to join teams, the ability to take music lessons. You're talking about children who've been thrown away to be cared for by two individuals and that they can't feed. So with that gloomy note, thank you, Dr. Eric. With that gloomy note, we move in our podcast to next week, where this gloomy note will be reprised and we will transform it into hopefully not a scary note, but a more likable note. So with that,
well, Dr. Lahab, can I say one thing?
I was going to sign off, but go ahead.
It doesn't have to be a gloomy note. It can be a positive note for every parent who has children to know that they need to expose them to an enhanced learning environment with love and support and education and good food, et cetera, and they can enhance and increase the dynamics of the brain development of their own children. That's a very positive thing.
With that positive note, we at the IFC bid you farewell. And as always, we sign off with I am not afraid.
I am not afraid.
I am not afraid.
We are not afraid, and we are the IFC's Individuation podcast, and we will see you, talk to you, and think about you. Until next week.